Welcome to Project Blackwood, where we dive into the stories behind businesses that shaped industries and sometimes fell apart. Today, we're examining General Electric, a company that once completely dominated its market but now serves as a fascinating cautionary tale. Let's explore what happened.
Glad to be here. And I have to say, looking through the archives for this one, it's a massive story. We aren't just looking at a company today. We are taking apart a giant.
A giant is putting it mildly. For generations, GE wasn't just a corporation. It was basically a proxy for the American economy itself. If you want to know how the GDP was doing, you didn't, check the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You just looked at GE's quarterly earnings.
Right, it was that integrated. And that is historically accurate right down to the stock market indices. It was the only original member of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which was established way back in 1896 to remain on that list for over a century.
The ultimate blue chip.
Exactly. It was the gold standard. It was the stock you bought for your grandmother's pension, and it was the stock you bought for your newborn's college fund. It represented safety and growth all wrapped into one ticker symbol.
But the mission for this deep dive, and looking at the stack of sources we have in front of us, it isn't to praise its success. We're looking at a much more complicated and frankly a much darker story. We have a monolith here that had the world's most valuable market cap. We are talking over $500 billion in the year 2000.
With the highest possible credit rating.
Yeah, AAA rating.
Right.
And yet it ended up forcing itself into a three-way breakup just to survive. So the central question we have to answer for you today is this. How does a company with such immense promise, a company that makes everything from the light bulb you read by to the jet engine that carries you across the ocean to the sitcoms you watch on TV, how does that company lose $540 billion in value and end up paying a dividend of a single penny?
To really understand that, we have to look past the usual bad luck narrative. You'll hear people in the financial press say it was just the 9/11 attacks or it was just the 2008 crash. But as we dug into the records, you have to look at the internal decisions.
The structural rot.
Right. Because the very engine that fueled this meteoric rise in the 1980s and 90s, which was this hyper-financialization and aggressive acquisition strategy, that exact engine became the toxic asset that nearly destroyed it.
It's the classic Achilles heel, the core strength turning fatal.
Exactly. This isn't just a story about a bad CEO having a bad quarter. It is a story about a foundational mindset shift. They shifted the soul of the company from making things to moving money. And when that shift collided with the reality of the 21st century, the whole conglomerate model it fractured.
Okay, let's set the stage so you can really feel the weight of this collapse. Take us back to the peak glory. Paint the picture of the year 2000.
The year 2000, the turn of the millennium. If you are an investor or even just a mid-level manager at GE, you are standing on top of the world. As you mentioned, the valuation is over $500 billion. It is quite literally the most valuable company on Earth.
Microsoft, Cisco, Exxon.
They were all looking up at GE.
And what's wild is that they were everywhere physically. It wasn't like a tech company today where you use their software, but it's invisible. GE was tactile.
Everywhere you look, you woke up to a GE alarm clock buzzing on your nightstand, you turn on a GE light bulb, you cook breakfast on a GE stove. If you took a flight to a meeting, the engines outside your window were GE. If you went to the hospital, the MRI was GE. And when you came home and turned on NBC to watch Seinfeld or Friends, well, NBC was GE too.
It felt invincible. Too big to fail, but also too expertly managed to fail. They had that famous training center, Crotonville.
The Hogwarts for CEOs.
Exactly. Everyone wanted to hire a GE executive. But let's contrast that. If we fast forward just 18 years to 2018, the picture is completely unrecognizable. What does the low point look like in the data?
By 2018, under the leadership of Jeffrey Immelt, the stock had lost that $540 billion in value from its peak. And the company, which had been the anchor of the Dow Jones since 1896, was unceremoniously kicked off the index.
That is a symbolic death right there. Being removed from the Dow is the market telling you that you aren't a proxy for America anymore.
It was humiliating for them. And for the shareholders, the retirees who relied on that quarterly check, the dividend, was slashed to 1 cent per share.
From the most valuable company on earth to a penny dividend. That is a free fall.
It really is. And to understand how they built this trap for themselves, we have to go all the way back to the origins. We need to look at the industrial DNA of the company. So let's trace the lineage back to 1878.
The Gilded Age.
Right. It's a time of massive industrial expansion and really ruthless competition. Most people think GE starts with Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb, having a eureka moment and everyone cheering. But the documents suggest it was far more cutthroat than that.
Yeah, digging into the early records, it wasn't just a smooth path to market dominance. It starts with the Edison Electric Light Company. Edison is the face. He's the genius. He's basically the Elon Musk of his day.
But he was also incredibly stubborn.
Very. By 1889, he consolidates his interest into the Edison General Electric Company. And his foundational mindset, his big bet, was entirely on direct current, or DC power systems.
Which was a problem because he had a major rival. And in a developing market, having a rival with better technology is an existential threat.
Exactly. The Thomson-Houston Electric Company, led by Charles Coffin, they were betting on alternating current, AC. And the market validation pace was clear. AC was winning. It could transmit power over much longer distances. They were eating Edison's lunch, winning the municipal contracts to electrify cities because the tech was simply more efficient.
So you end up with these two giants just bashing heads, suing each other over patents constantly.
Ruinous competition. They were spending more capital on lawyers than on R&D. They were blocking each other from actually growing the industry. And this is where the core DNA of GE is really born. It wasn't born out of a purely scientific breakthrough. It was born out of a financial arrangement.
Enter J.P. Morgan.
The titan of finance himself. In 1892, Morgan looks at this mess and orchestrates a merger. He sits them down and essentially says, stop fighting, merge. Create a monopoly that can actually afford the infrastructure costs to electrify the nation.
So General Electric was incorporated in April 1892. And Edison, he didn't exactly stick around to run it, did he?
No, he was effectively pushed out. They dropped Edison from the name, which was a huge blow to his ego. But the business logic for Morgan was sound. The initial capitalization was $50 million.
Yeah.
If you adjust that for inflation to today, that is roughly $1.5 billion.
Massive growth accelerator. For a startup in the 1890s, that is an enormous war chest. It was the first unicorn.
But even with that cash pile, they almost died immediately.
Right. The Panic of 1893 hits just a year later. It was a massive economic depression. Banks failed. Railroads collapsed. GE, this infant giant, faced severe liquidity issues. They nearly went bankrupt. And that early near-death experience established a culture of extreme conservatism that lasted for decades. They became obsessed with stability, with having cash reserves. They never wanted to be that vulnerable to the credit markets again. Keep that in mind because it makes their later actions so incredibly ironic.
So they survived the panic.
Yeah.
And they realized that to truly survive long-term, they need a moat. They can't just compete on price.
Exactly. They established the first industrial research lab in the United States in 1900. This was a paradigm shift. Before this, invention was done by lone wolves in workshops. GE decided to industrialize invention. They hired the best scientists and just let them experiment. Innovation became their moat.
And there was another strategic move in 1896 that feels, well, highly anti-competitive by modern standards.
The patent pool. GE and Westinghouse, the other massive player, basically agreed to share patents. They created a duopoly, they stopped the patent wars and started splitting the market. It stabilized everything, giving them the breathing room to innovate without fear of immediate litigation.
And because of that managed stability, they could crank out hits. Just looking at the timeline, 1896, the X-ray machine, that establishes their medical dominance right out of the gate. 1906, voice radio broadcast.
Yeah.
And critically, 1942, the first American jet engine.
We are definitely going to come back to that jet engine.
Oh, absolutely. That 1942 innovation, the IA engine built for the war effort, is the seed of the only part of GE that is truly thriving today.
But let's move forward. We get through the post-war boom, and by the 1970s, GE is a successful, diverse giant. But it's sluggish.
Very sluggish. Reginald Jones was the CEO, highly respected, considered a statesman of American business. But the company had become a bureaucracy. It was run by committees, thick operational manuals, incredibly slow decision-making.
The stock hit a low of $3.77 in 1974. Industrial stagnation. The company was stable to a fault. And this sets the stage for a radical change in philosophy. It sets the stage for the accelerator.
Right. We move into the 1980s, 1981 specifically. Jack Welch takes over.
Neutron Jack.
That was the nickname. And analyzing this transition, this is where the story shifts entirely from engineers' precision to financial efficiency. Welch looked at this bureaucratic behemoth and decided it needed to be shaken to its core. He didn't want a company that was just good enough. He demanded dominance.
What was his exact mandate for the divisions? He had a very famous rule.
Fix, sell, or close.
Yeah.
He declared that every single division of GE, whether they were making toasters, nuclear reactors, or plastics, had to be either number 1 or number 2 in its global market.
And if it wasn't?
If it wasn't, they would try to fix it. If they couldn't fix it, they would sell it. And if nobody wanted to buy it, they would just close it down. There was absolutely no room for mediocrity. It didn't matter if a division was generating a steady profit. If it wasn't dominant, it was gone.
Which sounds great on a business school PowerPoint, but he applied that exact same ruthless logic to the human beings working there. The rank and yank system.
Yeah, the vitality curve.
Yeah.
He mandated that managers strictly rank their employees. The top 20% were the stars. They got the bonuses, the stock options. The middle 70% were the core workforce. But the bottom 10%...
fired every single year.
Regardless of how the company was doing financially. If you fell into that bottom 10%, you were out. It created an intensely competitive, almost paranoid culture. Neighbors turning on neighbors in the office just to stay out of the bottom 10. The data on the workforce reduction during this period is genuinely brutal.
I was looking at those numbers. Between 1981 and 1988, that's just a 7-year window, GE eliminated 123,450 jobs through downsizing, and they divested another 122,700 employees through selling off divisions. The total headcount dropped from 404,000 down to 292,000.
Over 100,000 people losing their livelihoods in the name of efficiency. That is exactly why they called him Neutron Jack. Like the neutron bomb, he eliminated the people but left the building standing.
But here's the thing for the shareholders, and why Wall Street essentially canonized him as a celebrity CEO. It worked. The stock absolutely soared. And while he was aggressively cutting the industrial workforce, he was quietly building something else entirely.
Which brings us to our first revelation moment. The pivot to finance.
This is the crux of it. While the public still saw GE as the company making their light bulbs and jet engines, Jack Welch was turning GE into a bank.
Let's explore how that worked mechanically. What was GE Capital originally intended to be before Welch supercharged it?
Originally, GE Capital was a very boring captive finance arm. It existed purely to help you, the consumer, buy a GE fridge or a dishwasher, or to help an airline lease a massive GE jet engine. It provided financing strictly for GE products to grease the wheels of their own industrial sales.
Makes total sense. You sell the product and you provide the loan.
Right. But Welch saw a massive arbitrage opportunity. GE had that AAA credit rating we mentioned earlier.
Let's break down the significance of that for the listener. What does a AAA rating actually let a company do?
It is the absolute gold standard of corporate finance. It means the rating agencies S&P, Moody's, believe there is effectively zero risk of your company defaulting on its debt. It meant GE was viewed by the markets as safer than most sovereign governments. And because of that pristine perceived safety, GE could borrow money cheaper than almost anyone else on the planet.
So they have access to an ocean of incredibly cheap cash.
Exactly. They could borrow money at, say, 2 or 3% interest. And Welch thought, why are we only lending this cheap money to people buying our washing machines? Why not lend it to everyone?
So they started acting like a massive commercial bank.
Exactly. They started issuing credit cards, the GE Rewards card. They got heavily into financing commercial real estate. They got into insurance. They were leasing airplanes to airlines, rail cars, shipping containers. They morphed into a financial juggernaut.
Pure arbitrage. Borrow at 2%, lend it out at 8%, and pocket the spread.
And it was incredibly addictive for the management team. Because if you compare it to building a new jet engine, which takes 10 years of research and development, building massive factories, rigorous safety testing, and carries huge operational risks, lending money is instantaneous. It's instant profit on the balance sheet.
It also let them manage their earnings perfectly, right?
Yes, it smoothed out the earnings. If the industrial side, say, the power division had a bad quarter, GE Capital could just quickly sell off a real estate asset or release some financial reserves to hit the exact earnings target Wall Street was expecting. It was a magic trick.
How big did this shadow bank get inside the company?
By the late 90s, GE Capital was generating nearly half of the company's total profits. Just think about that. An iconic American industrial company making half its money from banking.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
It perfectly explains why the market cap went up 4,000% under Welch.
From $12 billion when he took over to $410 billion. He retired a legend in September 2001. Fortune magazine actually named him Manager of the Century. His autobiography was a massive bestseller. Every CEO in America was trying to copy the GE model.
But tracing the records, there was a massive hidden cost to this growth. He wasn't just growing organically. He was buying everything in sight to feed the beast.
600 acquisition.
600 distinct companies.
Yes, it was an acquisition machine. And there's a specific case study from the archives that perfectly illustrates his style and really highlights the shift in corporate culture. The RCA acquisition.
The Radio Corporation of America, a legendary innovator in its own right.
Absolutely. In 1986, GE bought RCA for $6.4 billion. Now, RCA had legendary research labs. They invented color television. But Jack Welch didn't care about the electronics or the R&D. He wanted NBC, the television network, which RCA happened to own.
He wanted the media asset and the cash flow.
Precisely. So he bought RCA, he kept NBC, and he systematically sold off all the electronics parts. He completely gutted the RCA labs. It was pure asset stripping. And it was a clear signal to the market and to his own employees that the soul of GE had moved from the laboratory to the deal table. They were no longer about building technology. They were about acquiring profitable assets, squeezing them for financial efficiency, and shedding whatever didn't immediately juice the stock price.
So Welch retires at the absolute peak. September 2001, he hands the keys to Jeffrey Immelt. And the timing, you really couldn't write a more tragic script for a new CEO.
Immelt officially took over on September 7, 2001, 4 days before the September 11 attacks.
Which brings us to the turning point, the Immelt era and the hidden rot. The 9/11 attacks were obviously a massive external shock to the entire global economy, but GE was uniquely exposed.
Highly exposed. On the industrial side, they obviously make jet engines, and the entire global aviation fleet was grounded. But on the financial side, they were heavily exposed to insurance claims through GE Capital. So Immelt gets hit with a crisis on day 5 of his tenure. The stock dropped 20% in the weeks following the attack.
But digging into the financial autopsy, the real problem wasn't just bad luck or external shocks. It was the structural fragility that Welch left behind.
Right. The Achilles heel we teased earlier. GE Capital worked brilliantly when the economy was booming and credit was easy to get, but it was essentially a shadow bank.
Let's define that clearly. What exactly distinguishes a shadow bank from a highly regulated traditional bank like Chase or Wells Fargo?
A traditional commercial bank takes deposits your checking account, my savings account. That money is relatively sticky. It stays there, and the bank uses it to make long-term loans. A shadow bank like GE Capital didn't have consumer deposits to fall back on. To fund all those massive commercial real estate loans and aircraft leases, they relied heavily on something called commercial paper.
Break down commercial paper for us. How does that mechanic work?
It's essentially short-term corporate debt, basically corporate IOUs. GE would borrow billions of dollars from the money markets for very short durations, 30 days, 60 days, maybe 90 days, at incredibly low interest rates. They would take that short-term cash and use it to fund long-term illiquid assets like a 10-year mortgage on an office complex. Then when the 30-day IOU came due, they wouldn't pay it off with cash. They would just issue a brand new IOU to pay off the old one.
Rolling it over. It sounds exactly like paying your mortgage with a credit card and then paying off that credit card with a different credit card every month.
That is exactly what it is. And it works completely fine as long as the market has absolute confidence in you and investors are always willing to give you that next credit card. But then came 2008, the global financial crisis.
Which is our revelation moment number 2, the shadow bank exposure.
The credit markets completely froze. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Trust evaporated overnight. Nobody was lending money to anyone, no matter what your credit rating was. And suddenly, GE Capital couldn't roll over that short-term debt. They had billions of dollars in commercial paper coming due in a matter of days and absolutely no cash to pay it.
The facade cracked.
It shattered. The entire financial world suddenly woke up and realized that GE wasn't this safe, boring, industrial giant making light bulbs and turbines. It was a highly leveraged hedge fund that was entirely reliant on short-term market confidence to survive. They were facing an immediate, fatal liquidity crisis. They literally couldn't fund their daily operations.
They needed a bailout to survive.
They needed Warren Buffett. He stepped in and injected $3 billion into the company. And I should note, it wasn't a charity mission. He extracted incredibly favorable terms. He got preferred stock paying a massive 10% dividend. They also had to go to the federal government and get the FDIC to guarantee their debt just to keep the lights on. It was profoundly humiliating for a company that had prided itself on being the strongest corporate fortress in the world.
The market looked at GE and realized, wait, you aren't making your money from engineering. you're gambling on commercial real estate and credit scores. And that realization started a slow, agonizing bleed for the stock. Immelt knew he had to fix a mix. He realized the Welch financial model was permanently broken. He had to get GE back to its industrial roots.
But here's the tragic constraint. To pay for the massive losses in the financial division and to de-risk the balance sheet, he had to sell the family silver.
Tracing the divestiture spree, what did he actually sell off?
He started shrinking the empire. He sold off GE Plastics for $11.6 billion.
Plastics. That's legendary. Jack Welch himself used to run the plastics division. It was the defining material of the 20th century for them.
Gone. He sold NBC Universal to Comcast in a staggered deal that valued it at roughly $30 billion.
So the media empire is gone. The TV show 30 Rock, which was literally a sitcom about GE executives, wasn't even owned by GE anymore.
And perhaps most painfully for their brand identity with the public, he sold GE appliances, the fridge, the dishwasher, the very products consumers actually touch, to Hair, a Chinese manufacturing company, for $5.4 billion.
That's heartbreaking from a brand perspective. The tangible things that made GE mean GE to the average person were all stripped away just to keep the corporate ship afloat.
And the analyst's insight here is crucial. Those were not bad businesses. They were solid, profitable, iconic divisions, but they were sacrificed to plug the massive holes left by the collapse of the financial engineering strategy. Immelt was forced to cannibalize his own company to save it.
So Immelt is desperate. He's shedding these legacy assets. He urgently wants to prove to Wall Street that GE is a high-tech industrial powerhouse again. He wants to be known for software, for the industrial internet, for their new platform predicts. And in 2015, looking for a massive win, he decides to make a huge bet, a complete double down on energy.
Which brings us to Chapter 4, the fatal mistake. The Alstom acquisition.
Set up the logic for this. Why did they do it?
On paper, if you were living in 1995, it might have made sense. In a desperate bid to boost the industrial side's revenue, GE buys Alstom's power business. Alstom was basically their massive French rival in manufacturing heavy gas turbines. The purchase price was $10.6 billion. Immelt pitched it to the street by saying it would expand their global installed base of turbines by 50%. He promised $3 billion in operational synergies.
Synergies, the favorite buzzword of every executive right before they destroy billions in shareholder value. It usually just translates to, we are going to fire a lot of redundant staff to save cash.
It's almost always a red flag. But the foundational mindset error here was much deeper. Immelt bet over $10 billion on fossil fuels specifically, large natural gas turbines, at the exact historical moment the entire global energy market was aggressively pivoting to renewables.
It was like buying a massive controlling stake in Blockbuster Video the exact year Netflix started its streaming service.
A perfect analogy. The costs of solar and wind generation were plummeting globally. Utility companies were freezing their orders for massive centralized gas turbines. The market was moving towards smaller, more flexible power grids or entirely green energy. But GE bought Alstom anyway. They were blindly chasing scale in an industry that was rapidly shrinking.
And digging into the filings, it wasn't just a poor macroeconomic bet. The internal numbers at Alstom were completely toxic.
Which is our revelation moment number 3, the goodwill bomb.
Unpack this for us. What did GE actually buy for $10 billion?
When you look closely at the accounting books, Alstom actually had a negative book value of $7.2 billion when GE acquired it.
Wait, negative book value? Meaning Alstom owed more in liabilities than it actually owned in physical assets.
Exactly. The liabilities vastly outweighed the assets. They effectively bought a financial sinkhole. And to account for the massive difference between the $10.6 billion purchase price and that negative $7.2 billion actual value, GE had to book an enormous amount of goodwill on their balance sheet.
Let's pause and explain goodwill for the non-accountants listening, because it's central to how this all falls apart.
Yeah. Goodwill is essentially an accounting plug. It represents the premium you pay over the fair market value of an asset. If a local lemonade stand has $10 worth of lemons in plastic cups, but I buy the stand from you for $100 because I think your brand is amazing and will grow, that extra $90 is recorded as goodwill. It's an intangible asset on the balance sheet that represents my belief in its future value.
But if that future value doesn't actually materialize,
then the accounting rules force you to write it down. You have to admit to the market that the asset isn't actually worth what you paid for it. And in 2018, reality finally came collecting for the Alstom deal. The bet failed so spectacularly and turbine orders collapsed so completely that GE was forced to take a goodwill write-down of between $22 and $23 billion.
$23 billion just vanished into thin air on a spreadsheet.
It wiped out years of retained earnings in a single stroke. It was a forced public admission that the largest industrial acquisition in the company's entire history was an unmitigated catastrophe. It was the corporate equivalent of lighting a massive bonfire with shareholder money.
And this triggers the final downfall. We are now in Chapter 5, The Reckoning. The year's 2017 and Immelt is finally out.
He resigns. The stock has lost $500 billion of value under his watch. The board brings in John Flannery. He's a GE lifer, a finance guy. But he only lasts 14 months. He simply cannot stop the bleeding. He starts looking under the hood and uncovers the true depth of the problems, massive underfunded insurance reserves left over from GE Capital, the total mess of the Alstom integration. But the board doesn't give him the time to fix them.
And then the symbolic death we mentioned earlier hits in 2018.
GE is officially removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average. After 122 continuous years, it was the ultimate signal that the old GE was completely dead. And you want to know who replaced them on the index? Walgreens.
Walgreens. A chain of retail drugstores replaced the engineering marvel that literally electrified America.
It perfectly illustrates where the modern American economy went. The dominance shifted from heavy industrial manufacturing to consumer retail, tech, and healthcare. It was the absolute end of an era.
So Flannery is ousted, and the board does something unprecedented in the history of the company. They bring in a cleaner from the outside, Larry Culp.
The very first outsider CEO in GE's history. He came from Danaher, which is another conglomerate, but one that was run with extreme, almost clinical operational discipline. Culp wasn't raised in the cult of GE. He didn't have any sentimental attachment to the legacy or the GE way. He didn't care about the corporate jets or the status. He only cared about the raw math.
And the math he found was incredibly ugly.
In Q3 of 2018, Culp has to rip the Band-Aid off and report the truth to the markets. A GAAP accounting loss of $22.8 billion in a single quarter, almost entirely driven by that power division impairment we just talked about.
And to save the cash, they desperately need to pay off their suffocating debt. He does the unthinkable, the empty halls moment.
He slashes the legendary GE dividend down to 1 single cent, a penny. It saved the company $3.9 billion in cash annually, which kept them out of bankruptcy. But for the institutional investors, the pension funds, the literal grandmothers who had held GE stock for 40 years believing it was as safe as a treasury bond, it was a massive betrayal. It was Larry Culp standing up and saying, "The party is completely over. This company is on life support."
Looking at the segment data from that time, the power division revenues were down 33%. The Alstom bet had officially failed. The Welch-era financial engineering had completely imploded. There was no clever strategic pivot left. There was no way out but to take the entire empire apart.
Which leads us directly to Chapter 6, the deconstruction.
It took Culp a few years of grueling work to stabilize a patient, to pay down most urgent debts, and to clean up the operational mess. But finally, in November 2021, he makes the historic announcement.
The official end of the conglomerate. Culp announced that General Electric would formally split into 3 independent, publicly traded companies. He argued to investors that the conglomerate discount meant the individual parts of the business were now worth significantly more than the whole.
Expand on that. The conglomerate discount, meaning investors were actively punishing the stock price because the company was just too complicated to understand.
Precisely. Investors absolutely hated the complexity. They didn't know what risk profile they were actually buying. Were they buying a shadow bank, a jet engine manufacturer, a wind turbine company, a failing natural gas power business? If you were a clean energy investor, you didn't want the risk of the healthcare division. If you were a medtech investor, you wanted nothing to do with the massive liabilities of the power grid business. So Culp said, fine, we will simplify the narrative, we will split it up, and let the market value each pure-play business on its own merits.
Walk us through the mechanics of how they actually dismantled a century-old giant. First, they executed a 1-for-8 reverse stock split in August 2021. That didn't change the value of the company. It was purely cosmetic to make the share price look respectable again, because the raw stock price had fallen so low it was down in the single digits at one point, looking like a penny stock.
An optical illusion to project stability before the surgery?
Exactly. Then came the actual spin-offs.
Who was the first to leave the nest?
GE Healthcare. They were spun off in January 2023. This is the precision med tech business. The MRI machines, the CT scanners, ultrasound equipment. It is a very solid, highly profitable standalone business. It trades right now under the ticker GEHC.
Then came the massive energy portfolio.
GE Vernova, spun off in April 2024. This entity holds the traditional power business and the wind portfolio. And yes, it includes those troubled gas turbines from the Alstom deal.
Analyzing their current position, how is Vernova actually doing today? Are they surviving the transition? It's a real fight. In 2024, they did manage to regain the #1 market share spot in gas turbines globally, but they are in a brutal dogfight with Mitsubishi Power. Just for context, in 2023, Mitsubishi held 35% of the global market, so Vernova has its work cut out for it. They're desperately trying to pivot their legacy business toward wind energy and modernizing the electrical grid. Of the three new companies, Vernova is definitely the fixer-upper.
And what was left after those two were carved out? The core, the successor.
GE Aerospace. This is the absolute jewel of the empire. This is the company that was strong enough to keep the original GE ticker symbol.
And this brings us all the way back to that 1942 jet engine innovation we talked about in Chapter 1.
It does. It is the purest expression of their original engineering DNA. Today, GE Aerospace, operating largely through its incredibly successful joint venture called CFM International, powers 75% of all commercial flights globally.
75%. That is unbelievable dominance. That is a real unbreachable economic moat.
It is a massive moat, and it's an incredible recurring revenue machine because selling the engine is just the beginning. Those engines need specialized replacement parts and highly technical servicing for decades. And if you look at the market capitalization today, in February 2026, GE Aerospace alone is worth $345.6 billion.
So the core industrial heart of the company is incredibly healthy.
It is thriving. But I want to point out a metric that really puts this entire journey into perspective. Look at the workforce. The Jack Welch era GE, at its peak, employed over 300,000 people. The new, highly focused GE Aerospace employs roughly 57,000.
That statistic really says it all, doesn't it? From a sprawling, complicated global empire of hundreds of thousands of people down to a hyper-focused, lean machine.
It is the difference between trying to maneuver a massive, slow-moving army and deploying a highly specialized special forces unit.
So as we pull all these threads together, we've traced the brilliant origins, the aggressive financialization, the devastating crash, and the final deconstruction. What does this all mean for you as an observer of business? Why does this specific story matter beyond just looking at historical stock charts?
I think if we reflect on this entire timeline, the most glaring lesson is about focus versus complexity. I always come back to the what-if counterfactual scenario because it is haunting. Imagine if Jack Welch had never aggressively expanded GE Capital. What if they had just used it to finance washing machines and stayed a boring, predictable industrial engineering company?
Well, they certainly would have been smaller.
Much smaller. They never would have hit that $500 billion valuation peak in the year 2000. They wouldn't have been the most valuable company on earth. But, and this is the critical part, they also wouldn't have nearly gone bankrupt when the credit markets seized up in 2008. And they wouldn't have been forced to fire sell their best assets. They might have ended up looking like a Honeywell, a very solid, respected industrial player. Or if they mismanaged their tech, they might have slowly faded into obscurity like Westinghouse.
But the relentless greed for exponential growth, that strict mandate to be #1 or #2 in absolutely everything, no matter the cost that pushed them to rely on financial engineering, and that shadow banking model eventually poisoned the entire well.
And the final statistics we just discussed completely validate that thesis. The fact that GE Aerospace alone is now worth nearly $350 billion proves that in the modern, hyper-competitive economy, extreme focus beats broad diversification every single time. You simply cannot be world-class at making network television sitcoms and originating commercial real estate loans and designing nuclear reactors all at the same time. The complexity will eventually crush you.
The dissolution of General Electric really does serve as the final tombstone for the 20th century conglomerate model. The idea that one elite management team can sit in a boardroom and expertly allocate capital across a dozen completely unrelated industries, that idea is dead.
It is a relic of the past. The global economy is far too specialized now.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over. If hyperspecialization is the absolute rule of survival today, and the sprawling conglomerate model is inherently doomed to collapse under its own weight, what does that mean for today's tech titans? Look at companies like Amazon or Alphabet. They are rapidly expanding far beyond their core competencies, dipping into healthcare, autonomous vehicles, entertainment studios, and grocery stores. Are they unwittingly building the exact same fragile, overly complex empires that ultimately destroyed General Electric?
It is a terrifying parallel if you are a shareholder in those companies. The arrogance of success often blinds management to the creeping rot of complexity.
A sobering thought for any empire builders out there,
Yeah,
and a stark reminder that sometimes being boring and focused is the only way to survive.
absolutely.
Well, that brings us to the end of this investigation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the archives of American industry.
It was a fascinating ride. Thanks for having me.
Until next time.